Hey, Jake Wellens here. Today I'm going to talk about how to write a great introduction paragraph and conclusion paragraph. You want to start your essay strong with a bang and you want to end well. You don't want to start with something that's going to bore the reader. You want to start with a hook usually, something that's going to grab the reader's attention. It could be a great quote. It could be a historical or current date link. It could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the literature yet. You can look at the intro as kind of an inverted triangle, where you go from more broad, the hook, to more specific. Generally, you want to end your intro with your thesis. That's your argument. So you kind of have to know your thesis and where you're headed, as well as your outline, really, for your body paragraphs, in order to know how to introduce it. Because how can you know what to introduce unless you know where you're headed? So everything is geared towards the thesis. One great way to start an intro, as I said, is with a hook. A hook is usually about 4 to 7 sentences, although you really want to consult your teacher. Some teachers want you to get right into the literature. Other teachers like a hook. So really, there's no one right way to do it. If you think of a hook in terms of about 4 to 7 sentences, you could provide a great quote about your essay. You could use an example from history. You could pose and start to answer important questions. You could define any key terms you're going to get to. All of these things are going to be important before you even introduce the literature. Ask your teacher, though, because there's no one right way. Here's an example hook from an essay about Lord of the Flies. This writer was writing on fear. He said, "You wake up from a vivid nightmare. Fear pulses through your body. It felt so real. Fear is a potent and real emotion that can incapacitate a person. Not all fear is negative, though. Sometimes fear helps us avoid danger. Fear begins to corrode and infect, however, when it's either irrational or not based on reality, or when it dominates our existence. One must constantly evaluate his or her fear to ensure that it's not taking over." So the topic was fear. The writer, she didn't get into Lord of the Flies yet. She introduced when is fear healthy and when is it corrosive. And we know the essay is going to be about that topic. Another thing you could do in a hook is you might pose key questions. What does it mean to lose your innocence in a healthy versus an unhealthy way? Or grow up and mature, if that's your topic. Why is it so difficult to have the courage to go against the crowd and sacrifice, if that's your topic? You could ponder, why are humans more inclined to see differences than similarities, if you're writing an essay about division versus commonality. So there's no one right way. Another great thing to do is look at key terms. Let's say you were going to write about the id, human instinct in Lord of the Flies. You could define it. The id is based on our natural instincts. It's the animal part of ourselves and our gut reactions. Any term that's difficult or that is subjective, you want to define in your intro so the reader knows what you're doing. If you were writing on human nature and you said the term duality of man, you could talk about how we all have different sides of ourselves, the good side and the more evil, selfish side. And how are you going to use that term duality? Another great thing is a quote. Let's say you were writing about propaganda. You could use Joseph Goebbels' quote, if you lie often enough, people will eventually believe you. If you're writing about propaganda, Nazi Germany, Stalin. If you're writing about fear, you could use FDR's quote. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. So you have a lot of choice. You could even start with historical examples. Let's say you were writing an essay about Animal Farm. You could reference the Soviet Union and Stalin. If you were discussing To Kill a Mockingbird, you could talk about the civil rights movement in America. If you're doing the Salem witch trials, you could make a comparison to McCarthyism in the 1950s. So you have a lot of choice. After your hook, you want to link what you just said to the book. That's the transition from hook to book. How does what I just talked about connect to the literature? Here are some examples. In William Golding's Lord of the Flies, he examines how powerful and influential the emotion of fear can be. I just linked it to the literature. In Arthur Miller's The Crucible, he illustrates the effects of groupthink and paranoia. If that were my hook, now I'm connecting it to the play. After you've mentioned the author and title, you generally want to keep the rest of your intro about the literature. You want to narrow down. You want to give appropriate background, maybe 3 to 5 sentences as you lead to your thesis. You don't do a whole plot summary. You can assume the reader knows the story. Instead, you give a narrow down with stuff that's only going to come up in your essay. Don't put things in your introduction that you're not going to actually mention. An example could be, if you scroll down, keep going, William Golding in his novel Lord of the Flies examines how fear dominates. That was the transition from the previous hook. Narrow down. Stuck on the island with no adults, the boys become frightened and scared. Initially, they project their fears onto a fictional beast, but they eventually let the fears get the better of them. The boys' trepidation and terror begins to transform them into savage creatures. Because they're so driven by fear, they become selfish, violent, and disrespectful. Their fear makes it an every man for himself society. That was the narrow down. You see, it's not a whole plot summary. Then the author ends with a thesis. In the novel, fear eradicates and demolishes order. So you had your hook, you had your link to the book, you had your narrow down, and then you had your thesis statement. But as I said, please consult your teacher on his or her preference of intros. Sometimes they want you to get right to the book. Titling is also important. Before you, or maybe after you write your essay, come up with a unique, creative, metaphoric title. Don't come up with a title that applies to everybody's paper. Don't come up with a title that's boring and could really relate to anyone. It has to be specific to your argument. Let's say I said, Outsider's essay on Ponyboy's growth. That's pretty boring. That's like the topic of the essay. But if I said, Finding the Gold Within, because the gold is an important quote in the book, that's a better title. George and Lenny's Dream in Of Mice and Men. Pretty boring. That's the essay topic. But if I said The Power and Beauty of Dreams Despite Hardships, it's a little better. Courage and To Kill a Mockingbird. That would be like the title of the assignment. But instead, Walk in My Shoes, which is an important idea from Atticus, now you have a better idea of courage as empathy. The boys turn savage in Lord of the Flies. Pretty boring. Savage nature trumps uncivilized nurture. That's a much better title. So you want to come up with a very unique title. If you scroll down, the conclusion paragraph is sort of the opposite. It goes from more narrow to more specific. In the first part of the conclusion, maybe 3 to 6 sentences, you sum up the main points. What are the main takeaways? You want to do this without being repetitive. So you have to use different words and sentences. After that, you can extend the more general to the sort of the so what question. Meaning, why does this matter on a level bigger than an essay? What's the takeaway? What can we learn from this? Okay? An example of a wrap-up. Now, after a wrap-up, I would do, all right, what's the so what? So let's say I was writing on this crucible. One example might be to give, let's say you were writing in your intro about a current day link. Maybe in your wrap-up, you go to the history, or vice versa. In your intro, in the hook, if I did something on a personal level. Maybe in the wrap-up, I tie it to a societal level. Okay, so you have to do it in a way that's different than your intro. Otherwise, it could get really repetitive. Okay, but the conclusion, think of it in terms of a regular triangle, more narrow to more broad. And when the reader leaves, he or she should think, oh, this matters on a level more important than an essay. So I hope this was helpful on introductions and conclusions. Remember, you want to start well and end strong. Those are the first and last impression on the reader. Thank you, and namaste.